So that was, it was performance-based. And so part of it was the team had to come up with substantiation criteria, not the owner. Right? So in essence, what was happening is that when we invited people to play, they developed their own rules, as long as they were within the framework in our RFP. They signed up for this. We didn't tell them to do it. They had ownership of what they were signing up for. That's a big deal in terms of getting them on board and having them all go in the same direction. The subcontractor must substantiate that the design met the requirements. One of those pieces was, well, how do you substantiate energy design? We required that they had to substantiate it, that it would meet that performance at time of turnover. What they did was they came in and said, well, here's the process we're going to use to do that. Part of that was energy modeling. The energy model had to match the as-built condition of the building at time of turnover. One of the things that we've learned about energy models is that energy models work great as long as they match the building. Right? When you see these papers written about how bad energy models are and how far off they are, and there's been some studies based on that, what you find if you really dig into that is the model doesn't match the building. Why is that? Well, maybe they did a conceptual model up front to give them some warm fuzzies. Maybe they did a model for code compliance. But a lot of things happen between design and the end of construction. That's why they redline plans and stuff, right? So just like you require as-built plans, we required an as-built energy model. The two had to match. Now, what did that do from a quality and substantiation point of view? In one of our old buildings, if the contractor forgot insulation in the wall, we would have to go and say, Mr. Contractor, you forgot to put insulation in this wall. And they were like, yeah, so? Right? And we'd have to go back to the plans and look at the plans, and they said, well, the architect only drew the squiggly line halfway down the wall, so we only put the insulation halfway down the wall. We're like, oh, no, that's just a representation of how you're supposed to put an insulation. Right? And then you get into this battle. And they say, well, we didn't bid that. It's going to cost you money to get insulation in that whole wall. Right? Or sometimes maybe they forget and you can get quality assurance to deal with it. In our case, you said, oh, you forgot the insulation in that wall. Just make sure the energy model reflects that. Poof! Insulation in the wall. Instantly. Amazing what it did for quality control. Because they knew that at the end of the day, they had to make those two things match. And they had a choice. That you could either rerun the model without the insulation, and guess what would happen then? They wouldn't hit the energy goal, right? And as in all good design and build, the penalty for failure is no payment. Okay? But it was amazing how much it did for the quality control by forcing the energy model to match the as-built condition. Yes, sir?
Did the model calibration require end-use calibration? Hourly, weekly, monthly? What was the level of detail granularity required in the model?
So it was, we did require that the model meet what's called ASHRAE Best Test 140. And so that basically forced them into an hourly model. Even though we are the developers of Energy Plus internally, they ended up using DOE2, along with a whole bunch of other models to augment it in order to deal with some of the innovation in the equipment. They also used a lot of radiance for the daylighting, because they knew they had to get some of those pieces right.
The question I think I'm hearing is, you said that the model, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I heard before, when I first heard say that, I think I heard what you heard. But then I heard you say the model had to match the as-built condition.
Yes.
It didn't have to match energy bills at turnover because
Nope.
there were no energy bills.
That's right.
So all the operating condition assumptions were decided on by committee?
We gave them a plug load profile. All right?
Plug load, light load, whatever.
Well, the lighting load was based on occupancy hours that we provided,
Right.
but then obviously they were trying to get daylighting into the space to get the lights down.
Right.
Right?
Right, but temperature schedules and
Temperatures, yep.
all that stuff was given.
Had to meet
them
ASHRAE,
by
comfort standards,
Right.
all of that was in the RFP.
We don't get that for most of our owners, by the way.
Yep. you could steal our RFP, right? It's all there.
So just to,
Yeah.
it was an as-built model, but there was no stipulation that it would have to match the energy bills
Yeah.
for 2 more years in the future.
Nope. And part of it is, so we've heard of people trying to do performance-based contracting that way. And, you know, where you hold some amount of money back and after a year you pay them if they meet the energy goal. As an owner, I mean, you know, first of all, most of those contracts I've seen, the owner ends up paying out, whether the building performs or not. There's not enough money involved and there's too much risk of litigation. Okay? And all the design build team has to do is say, well, you didn't operate the building right. Right? And you're done. Right? So we had the option of operating the building any way we wanted to. Now we had some incentive, and I'll show some actual performance graphs here in a little bit.
Yeah, just the general point is that many of us here involved in these buildings, and one of the critical points is that there is no measurement required in the future to show that the model results were accurate.
Yeah.
So that's
Our feeling is that if the model matches the physical conditions of the building, you can get within 10% without too much trouble. In fact, things like weather variation and other things play a bigger factor. But this dialogue where people say, well, the model was good within 50%, there's something wrong with the model matching the building, if that's the case.
What are you using for modeling?
So the team used DO2, yeah, and I forget which version, 2.1E-ish. They used radiance for the daylighting. They wrote a bunch of stuff from scratch. In fact, I think they may have put some trances into some of that to deal with some of the innovation. So, again, you know, that was a decision that they made. We really had pretty hands off on that. In fact, in general, we had very little involvement directly in the building, which is a very different change from where we were before. Let's see here. Created the RFP with stakeholders. We specified what we wanted from a performance point of view, not how to solve the problem, right? So an example is we never said anything like you cannot use operable windows. We said that you had to meet certain federal requirements for forced entry, right? Now it's kind of a funny dialogue because guess what the first set of plans had? All these really nice operable windows. The engineer loved it, natural ventilation. The people loved it. Security had a nervous breakdown. Right? Can you imagine that? And they said, those windows operate. And we're like, yeah. And they're like, well, you can't do that in a federal building. And we're like, you know, and so even the team, as well as the contractor, had to say, no, where did we violate what the RFP said? You go back to the RFP. Everything was based on the RFP. And it said, you know, certain braking strength for entry is what it needed, right? The design team went back and proved back to our security team that it took more force to break that window in its open position and crawl in than breaking the glass and crawling in. Problem solved. Okay? So, you know, that's how they dealt with a lot of the pieces. The design team, you know, I mean, they were just as serious as the contract as we were. And again, our contract manager really held that pretty tight. We did shortlist the 3 teams. We sent out an RFQ nationally, request for qualifications, looking for people that had an interest and had the bonding capability to do this kind of project, and had some interest in doing low energy buildings with very little specifics. We used their standard kind of corporate profiles that they send in, if you're familiar with that, with doing procurement. We evaluated those teams based on those. There was a merit system point. We picked 3. And we paid for those, and we actually required them to do conceptual designs at that point. And we were willing to pay the losers. The winner got rewarded by getting the contract. Okay.
Is there a maximum price that you would pay for the conceptual designs?
So it was set up front. It was, I want to say, $300,000 for that. I mean, it was fair, but it also, the other part here was sharing risk. And so it was enough that we could get good answers, but it wasn't enough to probably fully pay, depending on how much their marketing machine wanted to take over. We've heard that they did spend more money than that, but it wasn't enough that they, they weren't going to make money, but they really didn't lose a lot of money in that process. But it was important to pay them for that. In exchange, we owned those designs. And we were able to share those designs with the winning team, and they could opt whether or not to use some of those ideas in the final design. But the other part of it is by the time a team gets that far, they're pretty heavily invested in that design, and they're going to want to move forward with it. But they did pick and choose some other ideas. And so, as I mentioned before, we selected the best value for that fixed price. Okay, now, there was an off-ramp in there, if you want some of the nitty-gritty details, where they were allowed to go back and complete a little bit more design work before signing up for a guaranteed fixed price. But what it did allow them to do, the moment that first contract was signed, they went out and procured the concrete, the steel, and some of the big parts. So, question?
So you did this as a design, build, delivery method. It sounds like a lot of what the success was, you guys spent an enormous amount of time up front defining what you wanted, performance-based from a building.
Yes.
Do you think that this would work equally well in a design, bid, build delivery method?
So the problem with the design, bid, build, delivery method is that there's a disconnect between the architect engineering team and how they price it. And when you put it back out onto the street, if there's anything that looks at all out of place, the price goes up. Right? And so what you're going to see here, I mean, there are things in this project. There's 42 miles of radiant tubing in this project. Right? And they, as a team, said, we really need to do this because it's a big energy saver. Right? How are we going to do that at the same cost as ductwork? Right? So they went back to the vendor. They went to the subcontractor, the mechanical sub, and they innovated around that, and they came up with actually a rollout mat system for the tubing, which very interestingly that manufacturer is now selling as a product. They pre-assembled it all off-site, they pressurized it off-site. They came up with that innovation. This building has twice the exterior skin of a conventional square box building. Well, how did they do that and not kill the cost budget? Right? They pre-engineered these precast concrete with insulation integral, glass included, everything done, smooth finish on the inside so they didn't have to drywall, and they hung them on a steel frame. And every panel's identical. And so they were able to very carefully control the quality off-site and bring that stuff to site. So they had to bring that innovation, which I don't think you get if you have to put a bid in the middle of it. Sure. Now, I think long-term, if enough of this comes out so that people start to realize, like, well, there's enough radiant floor systems, or in our case, ceiling systems out there, you can do it competitively. There's enough cost basis that you can go into means and other databases looking for that. You could probably move back to a bid process. But part of what this did was it unleashed the creativity of the design team. Because they were kind of given some boundaries. They were given a sandbox, and you can do anything you want to in that sandbox. Don't exceed $64 million and meet the requirements of the RFP. You solve the problem. We were paying for professionals to come with solutions. Way too often what I see is that the architect, trying to please the owner, says, well, what do you really want here? And the owner says, well, I don't really know. Give me some ideas. Right? And they come up with their ideas. There's too much dialogue back and forth. Right? And that dialogue costs money. And this was saying no. And a lot of times, I as the owner say, well, I want this building to be energy efficient. You better use a variable speed fan over here. Right? I'm solving the problem. Right? Not the people that I've hired to solve the problem. So what this did was actually enabled them to be creative. Enabled them to bring this to the marketplace.
What was the time frame of that process to develop the guaranteed maximum price?
So it took us about probably 6 to 9 months to put the RFP process together initially. It took us about 3 or 4 months to do the actual contracting, interviewing. I guess there was also There's about a 3-month window in there to actually come up with the conceptual design. They then had, from the time they got the contract, there was about 6 months before they had to guarantee the price. But at the end of 6 months, they could leave the project. They would have gotten paid for that conceptual design. So they had some risk, and we as the government also had risk. One of the things that was important about all of this was sharing that risk. You know, contractors don't want to take any risk, owners don't want to take any risk, and what happens is everybody has too much risk at that point. And we really had a lot of dialogue about how do we share that risk. Yes, sir.
So how did you share the risk, and what were the documents that made up the contract for the work? Were you using AIA documents? Were you using the IPD documents?
You know, I am not on the contracting side, but I could find out.
All the risk lies within the contract,
Yeah.
so I'd be very interested to find out.
Yeah, I can get you all that. That would be fine.
Thank you very
Yes.
much.
From a big picture, it was things like, you know, when they did the conceptual design, they put more money in, and we didn't pay for that design until after, you know, we were willing to pay the $300,000, but by the time they finished that 6 months, they had a lot more in it. So they had a huge vested interest to make sure they still came in at that maximum price. Okay? The most we would have been out is the $300,000, but we would have had a design that would have been worth more. And I don't know, I guess if they had walked out, if we would have gone to a traditional bid at that, I don't know.
The bond would.
Don't want to guess
You're
that.
all right.
What's that?
The bond would have kicked in. You
Yeah.
would have been all right.
Yeah. So, yeah, when we get into the contract, you know, I'm kind of the engineer that conceptualized on the zero energy pieces. So, there was an incentive, and it was a voluntary incentive program. And it basically was set up, it was interesting going to our contracting officer and saying, we want $2 million to spend without any strings attached, no deliverables attached to it. Okay? It is the best $2 million we have ever spent. Because what it did was it really aligned people to listening back to the owner outside of what the contract might say. It was really for people pleasing, if nothing else. And it was a one-sided dialogue. Every month we had a list of criteria, things like safe design, meeting energy goals, basically that criteria you saw. And we would score the team on how we thought they were doing in achieving that. And if they met expectations, guess how much money they got? 0. We've already paid for that, right? That's what the contract said. If they exceeded the expectation, like if they came in and said, well, we thought of a bunch of things, instead of 25, we think we can do it at 24,000 BTUs per square foot. Well, that's exceeding expectations. And so we would cut them a check for that. It was interesting, after the first month, they basically got 0. And they complained, right? They said, well, we've been working hard, and you haven't given us any free money. And we're like, no, you've done what the contract said. And in fact, if you're going to argue, we're going to take our voluntary incentive program and go home. Because we're telling you this is what we see, our perception of what we see. You guys should go back and think about that. And it actually really helped tune that team to listen to what some of the subtleties were from the owner's point of view. You know, and some of the things, I mean, the RFP was probably 97% complete, but it's not total. There is still room to say, what does the building look like? Do you like this finish better than this finish? Those kinds of things. And it really helped tune those pieces of it. Yes?
That's your engineering job. Quick question. Was 42 mile of radiant pipe, was it PVC in concrete slabs? Was it the radiant floor?
It's the-
How was cooling done? How was outdoor air ventilation?
Okay, we'll talk about that. I'm going to talk about some of the details of the building. So, yeah, let me talk about a little bit about the process, and then, yeah, I do actually very well at, you know, boring everybody else with the engineering. I think I probably said most of this. Set the energy goal based on past measured office building research. So we looked at a lot of the simulations we had done. We looked at the optimizations we had run over the years. We looked at some smaller buildings and what their energy performance was. And we were pretty convinced that you could do a 50% building at no additional cost. And rather than saying 50%, we put the number at 25. Whereas my marketing people, right? It was like, that seems like a nice round number to pick, We did provide normalization for space efficiency and for external users of the data center. We talked about calculation method. We didn't want them to assume anything, right? And even though we knew some of the numbers weren't exactly right, we set them. And we said, that's what it is. You know, you don't have to like them, but those are the rules that we are going to play by today. We did have the current, we actually went into our old facilities and looked at our plug loads. I'll talk about plug loads because it was a big part of it. Benchmark those and then set targets for us as an owner for plug loads that we were going to have to hit to get into this new building and meet the objectives. Again, you talk about operationally, we didn't have to get there, right? But we were going to really try hard because otherwise we wouldn't have met the goal overall. So it was, you know, again, that was something that we took on as an owner risk piece of it. Let's see, and the schedules that went with it. Thermal comfort requirements, we did require that they do some energy monitoring so we could validate it after the fact. Again, it had nothing to do contractually at that point. And all of these pieces had some kind of substantiation. How are you, as the design team, going to prove to us that you've met our objectives? And again, you know, by the time they got into it, they really defined their own problem and their own solutions. I think that was critical in getting the buy-in. We did provide zero energy building definitions. We made a slight modification, and it shows up on the energy calculation, where we did site energy, but what we did was we penalized them if they chose electric resistance heating in any way. And that was hot water, space heating, anything electric resistant. But it was interesting, there was one place they took the penalty. They went to point of use